dynamite, basically. Her name is Lami Ulibile, so she'll be the chairperson for the next session. Just before we get started on this session, just to remind you that after this session, we'll be going on a tea break, and after the tea break, we'll be going into breakaway rooms. Breakaway room 1 is in here, breakaway room 2 is next door to the right, breakaway room 3 is to the left, and breakaway room 4 is at Maropeng Hotel Restaurant. So those of you who will be interested in going to the litigation and strategic communication breakaway session, please make sure that you start making your way to that side at least at 3. Yes, 3. Without taking any more of your time, Lami and your panelists, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Big Homo. I thought that being here on the stage, I won't get called out anymore, but I guess I didn't escape. Hello, everyone. As Kane mentioned, I'm Lami Ulibile. I'm from the Australia Lesbian Foundation for Justice. I'm joined here by an amazing group of panelists who I'll give a chance to introduce themselves soon enough. I want to thank the Other Foundation, of course, always for this amazing, invigorating platform. And I want to thank the speakers that came before us, because I feel they've done an amazing job of grounding us in some of the really, in some of the frameworks that we need to be thinking about if we're thinking about shaping, reshaping, co-creating strategies together. So thank you very much, Dr. Comrade Vilikas and Liberty Mathis and your panelists earlier today. I've drawn a lot of inspiration from what you all shared with us today. And in reflection to what you were saying, Dr. Comrade Vilakasi, I've just given you a first name. Thank you. So you were talking about the colonial project, and I was reflecting on that, thinking that one of the objectives of the colonial project is to stigmatize, to criminalize, and to eventually invisibilize queer and diverse identities. So now, as LGBTQI organizing has really emerged strongly within Southern Africa, I guess one of our questions is, what does it look like to emerge and reclaim and expand space, and for us to be active participants in developing narratives that shift norms and win public hearts and minds? And to, in response to Steve Litike's challenge as well, how can we speak in a language that those we seek to influence can understand and connect with? The objective for this session today is to share some approaches, learnings, and reflections. We have these amazing panelists who will also draw from their own experiences to talk about how they've approached some of these questions in defining messages in communications, in evidence-based communications. So I welcome you, folks, and I'd like to start with you, Stephen. If you could maybe introduce yourself and speak a little bit about your work and how you've come to this work.
Thank you very much, Ilami. In the previous session, there was also Stephen, and I'm also Stephen. So I think there's an outbreak of Stevens here. But I'm Stephen Matenga, and thanks to our former president, Mr. Mugabe, the media in Zimbabwe collapsed to the extent that we found more journalists unemployed. So as a result, we decided to collaborate all unemployed journalists who are now working as freelancers to come up with an organization called the National Association of Freelance Journalists, which I lead as its Secretary General. We are not really an LGBTI specific activist group, but because of the frustrations that we also faced within the country, including silencing of the media, we decided to focus on issues that are undercovered by the conventional media, such as key human rights issues, the rights of children. That's also where we picked the topic of the rights of the LGBTI community. So I'll not talk about the other work that we do as the association, but I'll focus mainly on the projects that we are doing as the National Association of Freelance Journalists. You will find that if you ask a journalist what does the L on the acronym LGBTI stand for, they don't even know. And in our workshops, we found out that some people had never met people from the LGBTI community. So, among other agents of socialization, such as the church, the education system, the media also plays a role in reinforcing stigma and discrimination. So our project basically is to bring to the journalists key issues about the LGBTI community. We want the media to understand what is the LGBTI community. Do they exist? What are the issues that they face on a day-to-day basis? Our hope is that when they understand those issues, it also improves their coverage of the issues. Because when you understand something, it also results in tolerance. So that is our total vision of the project for now.
My name is Brian Likomeka, and I'm based in southern Malawi, city of Atlanta. We work in an organization called Center for Solutions Journalism. And in our organization, we have two key program areas. That's LGBTI and the SRHR. What we do, we implement our projects in two ways. First of all, we train media practitioners on how to report on the LGBTI issues professionally. We also produce content for television, radio, online, and even newspaper. Because sometimes even when we train journalists, they don't reach the mark which we intend. So we even have our own studios where we produce content which goes into the many national media outlets. In the process, we also discovered that it's also important to engage some stakeholders. So besides engaging the media, we also engage stakeholders, including religious leaders, traditional leaders, and even politicians. That's the work that we do in Malawi. And our key focus is to make sure that the anti-LGBTI laws in Malawi are decriminalized. That's the key focus that we have. But we do that using the media. Thank you.
My name is Brian Pellett. I'm the founding director of Taboo Media. We're a media development organization based in Cape Town, and I actually work very closely with Brian in Malawi, Stephen at NAFJ. Essentially what we do, we have three main components. We started in 2015 working on journalism development. So what that meant was doing much of what my colleagues here do in terms of working with journalists to improve coverage of queer issues in many different countries. But then we realized a missing component was actually working with the activists about how to better get their message into the media. So we started that as a component in 2017, and now we often do trainings in parallel. So we'll do, say, 2 days of a journalism workshop, 2 days of an activist media engagement strategies workshop, and then bring the journalists and the activists together on the last day so that the journalists actually get practice interviewing activists, and activists get practice in delivering their message in the way that we talked about in terms of crafting the core message and framing it in a way that will be receptive to the audiences, those sorts of things. So journalism development, media engagement trainings, and then the final component is the Media Monitoring and Response Coalition. So yesterday we had a side meeting on that specifically, and it's kind of a long name, but it's exactly what it sounds like. We media monitor, so that's journalists, activists, tracking media coverage of queer issues in our communities. But then going beyond that, we're also starting to respond to that coverage as a coalition. So what does that mean? Well, it can mean many different things, but one thing we want to do is reach out to journalists. If they've done a great job, thank them for doing accurate coverage, give them suggestions for future stories that they can cover. But if in the process of the reporting, people's lives are put at risk, people are misgendered, etc., we want to intervene in a way that improves that coverage in the future, or if a more rapid response is needed in the interim, basically enable people to take that response. So I might speak a bit more of that about that later, but just a public service announcement. During that breakout session tomorrow from 1:30 to 3, one of those meetings will be about the Media Monitoring and Response Coalition. So we'll have details on that, and you're all welcome to join.
Thank you.
Hi everyone. My name is Carla Sutherland. I run a small consultancy firm in New York called, thanks to Shakes actually, Sharp Consulting. And previously I worked for the Ford Foundation, for the Arcus Foundation, and for the other foundation, developing programs on the continent around how to advance the rights and well-being of LGBTI people. I also work in South Africa quite a lot as an associate researcher for Singizi, which is a research and evaluation group that focuses on gender and sexuality as the one area of expertise, and youth employment as our other area of expertise. I had a whole prepared thing, and then I listened to this morning's panel, which I thought was fantastic and really important. So I dumped what I was going to say, and I've rewritten something else. So you'll forgive me if I read a little more. But I just think linking what we heard this morning to the idea of public campaigning is actually really important. So first of all, I just wanted to say from my heart that it is wonderful to be back home. It's just nice to be here. And I also wanted to acknowledge and say that I think this is one of the bravest and certainly the most beautiful movement that I've ever worked with. And I was talking to Fikile earlier about when we were young, which was a remarkably long time ago. And just starting this work, and none of this seemed possible. There were 3 or 4 people having lunch at restaurants. There were 5 or 6 people hiding in their classrooms somewhere. The idea that we would get to this space is so unbelievable. And I always think it's important to pause and say, well done. Because I think it's easy when you're on a road that is rocky and long to not take the time to look backwards and say, well done. So well done. And I also wanted to say that I think that this is an important moment in this road that we're walking. And I think Neb was right to talk about it as a tipping point, where we can take stock of what we've done well, but also to think creatively and strategically about what is needed as our context changes. And I think our context has changed a lot. I think as a movement, we've been very successful at a number of things, but I want to focus on advocacy in particular. I think this arena, we've been very good at targeted advocacy. And it's a strategy that's made many gains in all sorts of places, in politics, in health, in religion, in education, in journalism. It's been a strategy that's largely been aimed at leadership. But I think what this morning's panel points to is the need now to take those gains broader and to focus our energy in a more concentrated way on the wider public. We need, I think, to be finding ways to more effectively shift the needle on broader public opinion on LGBTI issues. I recognize that in countries where it's illegal, highly stigmatized, deeply politicized, and often violent, both emotionally and physically, that it's a lot to ask or to imagine. But I really think we can do it if we're able to move beyond political rhetoric and pride marches that both have their places, but that need much more. I think the roots of the ways in which we might do that are embedded, we're embedded, in the face of their voters and constituencies being so opposed to us. And also understanding that that opposition, as you also heard this morning, deliberately misleads, lies, maligns, and uses us for political ends. So I'm involved in 2 initiatives that are trying to tackle these kinds of issues. And we're coming at it, both initiatives, from 4 distinct perspectives. The first is that communicating and messaging is not about finding the perfect slogan primarily it's about strategy. Working to get there and the place of communication in there. Secondly, that we have to shift our discussion from political to values-based conversations. Stigmatization is a visceral. Thirdly, it needs to be evident. We worked with 4 partners in Cameroon, Nigeria, Mozambique, and Zambia to explore the development of a methodology. So not an end result of particular messages, but more about a methodology about how to think strategically about communications and how to develop messages for the wider public that meets them where they are at, not where we want them to be. Then to test them and to find ones that work best. Creators, to create an African community of practice, to break down those silos of activists being able to talk to researchers, researchers being part of the conversation with creators around how you develop and popularize big messages. I can't go into either of those projects in detail, I've talked too much already, but we do have an exhibition outside that names it, the booklet has been produced, you can download it and use it, and the communities of practice work is only just beginning, and if you would like to be part of it, then please talk to any of us. And by any of us, I mean Cal, Lambda, Transbantu, Amsha, who are all partners that have been involved in different ways with this work. And if there's interest, we might do a self-organized space to think about these issues in more depth. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kyla. And thank you so much, everyone, for sharing the different ways that you approach this kind of work. This session is also an invitation to a lot of people who are in this room, activists who sort of are either communications officers within their organizations or advocacy officers, or you hold that kind of role within your organization to engage with us much more deeply on these issues. There will be about 20 or so minutes where we'll open up the floor for questions and comment. So we'd also love to hear from you about your own experiences of doing communications or evidence-based communications work. But right now, I think it would be great to hear a little bit more from our panelists about what you've learned from doing this kind of work. What are some of those concrete examples where you have seen pushback, some successes, when applying the different approaches that you do? Shall I start with you, Brian? I saw you taking down a lot of notes.
Yeah, I was taking notes on Carla's presentation.
Some reflections.
Get that booklet later.
Yeah, you can start there, that's good.
Start here?
With some reflections to Carla's presentations, if you like.
Oh, it wasn't so much reflections, I was just taking notes that I want to follow up on. So I'll do that. In terms of concrete things we've seen, I was sharing with a few people recently. So one example, we were working closely, as I mentioned, we do these regional journalism trainings. So for that, it's all of sub-Saharan Africa, so West Africa included. And one of the journalists from our 2017 regional training just launched a journal called Rage, which specifically looks at queer issues in the Liberian context. And basically, he told me that the idea for that came out of this journalism training. He saw that that wasn't being covered in a way that was accurate, that was effective in his community, and then took the step to actually go ahead and do this. I think one of my favorite examples of positive progress we've seen immediately after our training. So when we were doing a training in Zimbabwe in November, one of the speakers is a trans woman who was launching a beauty brand that same week. Alessandra Brie Chacha, maybe some people know her in the room. Anyway, a journalist interviewed her, and in writing the story, sent it to me first so I could have a look at it, help with editing, some mentorship there, and then we saw this great story come out immediately afterwards. So it basically elevated this exciting economic story in the Zimbabwe context, and obviously giving a good voice to Brie, without falling into some of the tropes that we often see in reporting on trans and LGBTQI issues.
Thank you so much, Brian. And Stephen, you work with quite a number of stakeholders as well. I wonder how are they responding to this kind of work, intervention?
Maybe I should answer with a small story. At one time, a child fell in a well, like a small well. Then people were trying to rescue the child. They put the first rope, but the first rope did not reach the child. Then they went all over to look for the second rope, but the second rope did not reach again. Then they went for the third rope, and it did not reach again the child, until the child said, "Why can't you just join the ropes?" Yeah, so what I'm trying to say is that I think activism should not, I think, I can't remember the exact words, don't leave anybody behind. So we find that we have many organizations across Southern Africa doing almost the same work, but some of it becomes repetition because of fragmentation. So I think it is very necessary that even from the basic, from the design of programs to incorporate all stakeholders. But there's one thing that you said just now, Kara, that nothing for us without us. We are writing a program to train journalists on how to cover the LGBTI community. So we decided, after our first workshop, I think Brian came to, he's one of the main facilitators to Zimbabwe. After the training was attended by 25 journalists, but we only got 4 articles. And in our review, we're asking ourselves, why are we not having so many articles after such a training? Then we realized that we are training a certain group of people who are journalists to report on issues that are not even part of them. So we are almost now shifting our approach right now. We are now training the activists some journalism skills so that they become their own voice. And as part of our project, this year we are going to establish a platform where they can also publish. And that platform, I think, will be open to the rest of Southern Africa. Activists and journalists alike, a space where they can post their own stories.
And I think maybe, Carla, you could share a little bit about your methodology. I think you started to talk about that a little bit, but I know you are also working very closely with LGBTQI activists and organizations in a similar, maybe different kind of way.
What we wanted to do was break down the boundaries of research and evaluation. Part of the reason I have bright lights flashing over my exhibition is because most activists I've met switch off as soon as they hear about research and evaluation. And I think that has come about for 2 reasons. One is that I think very often the deep knowledge and expertise inside of organizations, community advocacy organizations, is often not valued enough by researchers, and that we need to be building better connections around it. But I also think research and evaluation has been mystified and made into something that really it's not. So one of the big aims of our project was to begin to, rather like Stephen is talking about, rather than bringing researchers in, saying to activists, you have research skills and you're asking the right questions and you're answering them in different ways. The one step that you might not be doing is testing them a little bit. So when we developed messages collectively through a whole process, one of the things that we did was identified 5 messages that activists thought might work. And then we took those 5 messages and we tested them with audiences that we thought might be most open to hearing whether we could change their minds about how they saw LGBT issues by sharing those messages with them. And we tested them in very different ways. One group had small groups. They asked their friends and their family and university students to come together and they talked collectively around what that message was. That's easy to organize. It doesn't cost any money. It's not dangerous. The kind of thing anybody can do. We also went all the way through to hiring a telephone company called Geopol, which could test messages using smartphones that are widespread, and we could test the message with a very particular group of people, up to 300 very quickly and with very little money. So we used that range of resources depending on where people were working. But the patterns that we got back of information were very interesting. The one message that we tested was, globally, there are human rights. We think those human rights should apply in Nigeria. We think that it also should apply to homosexuals, which was the wording that Nigeria wanted to use. And not only did almost nobody agree with that, the passion and the disagreement with which people pushed back against that idea was incredibly strong. But the most successful message that we used, that we developed as a group, was life is hard for everyone. But everyone deserves access to health and education and dignity. That includes homosexuals. So actually the content of both of those things is not very different. Access to health and education and dignity are human rights, but because the language being used was different, instead of not everybody, and I mean like everybody disagreeing with it, we got 3 or 4 people to say, yeah, absolutely. We got a lot more, up to 5 or 6, to say yes, but not dignity, and then some people to say no. So it was a very simple exercise, and it allowed, any activist could do that. It's really not a difficult thing to do. But it then enabled people to come back together and reflect on different ways of working and thinking much more carefully about the wording and the frame that they use, not only in big campaigns, but on their website, when they release press releases, and when they go and talk to journalists. And steering clear of naming human rights actually seemed a really important lesson to have learned. So that's the kind of work that we do.
I appreciate that, particularly the comment about centering the knowledge and expertise of LGBTQI activists in doing this work, because I really think it's so important as well for movements to recognize that they do have expertise and knowledge to contribute to this kind of work, and that helps to cultivate or at least contribute to the agency that activists feel in doing their own work. I want to ask you, Brian Ligomeka, about what you feel is maybe the future of this kind of work for LGBTQI activists, because, and if I may speak for other groups as well, I think we have sort of been doing this work, putting out press statements, creating different hashtags, creating different messages. Tashwa earlier talked about the different way that the Lerabibo court case used their own communication strategy, developed their own communication strategy, and what worked and why it worked. So I'd love to hear from starting with you, Brian, and then maybe the rest of the panelists about what the future looks like, what the implications for this kind of work are for the future.
Thank you so much. I think from the feedback that we have from some of the media practitioners, we in the LGBTI community also have work to do in terms of strategic communication. One of the things that we should work hard on is how do we reframe our messages? How do we frame our communication to the different audiences that are out there? When we do an analysis of the sort of framing that we do with our communication, most of the communications actually border on communicating from what I would describe as a victim or fear point of view. We are suffering, we are being harassed, we are being assaulted. It's good because we are indeed suffering and we need to actually communicate so. But maybe we shouldn't end there. We should move from the type of framing that we have, the victim framing. Because when we portray ourselves as victims, what reaction do we expect? When you are a victim, you are seeking sympathy, most of the time. When we project our messages, frame our stories as victims, it means we are begging sympathy. We are not begging for sympathy. We are claiming our rights. So that should come clearly in our communication. The fear projections, the victim framing, yeah, it works sometimes, but let us work on them. And we have another framing that we also see, we are seeing and analyzing, is the anger framing, condemnation. My colleague is using naming and shaming. Yes, that's another framing of communication that we are also using. But the question is, when you condemn, what reaction do you expect from the one who is being condemned? When you condemn, What reaction are you expecting from the audience? It's also important to actually think about that when communicating, about the reactions that we will get when we use different frames, such as the victim frame, the fear frame, or the anger frame. One of the frames of communication which we are not using regularly, which is also important, is the frame of hope. As LGBTI community, we need to start celebrating our success stories. We have challenges, yes. We have issues, yes. But there are also some achievements that we need to celebrate. And they should be amplified and highlighted. The moment that you are celebrating, even the opponents will be surprised. Why are they celebrating? What victory have they gained? That's the beauty of using the hope or the celebratory or the victory frame in our communication. But if all the time we are just highlighting about the violations, the harassment, the assaults, we don't even have a single moment to celebrate our victories, then we are not doing justice to strategic communication of LGBTI issues. So we also need to consider that. Another thing in campaigning, just like in politics, should we be communicating against homophobia? Should we be communicating for? Is it a campaign against or a campaign for? So we can also campaign for our rights, for equality, for diversity, for coexistence. Sometimes we focus so much on the dark side. You are busy campaigning against, forgetting that there are some things that you need to claim as a citizen and even as an activist. So we need to work on our framing.
Thank you so much, Brian. I'm so glad I studied with you in this last round of comments from our panelists. Big Homo, the big man in the pink shirt over there, just told me that we're running out of time. So I'd like to encourage the panelists to maybe be a little brief, if you so. Would you like to comment, Brian? You don't have to.
Yeah, I would actually like to comment about, you mentioned what is the future of all of this. And I think it's positive, but it can be a double-edged sword. The future in terms of what we as activists in the room need to communicate changes quite a bit because we're having more and more journalists covering these issues. In the past, I've done media scoping and media analysis studies. We've seen very little coverage in many countries and in many contexts about these topics. And usually when they were being covered in places where there was little coverage, it was extremely negative. So I think, as a communication officer or the executive director of a group working on these issues, you would assume if a journalist got in touch with you, okay, this is a hit job, they're just contacting me so they can take my quote out of context and write a terrible story that puts people's lives in danger. That's gladly, hopefully, positively no longer necessarily the case. We should always be skeptical of journalists and their intentions, especially when we don't know them. But we really need to develop some of the strategies that Brian was mentioning and that Carla was mentioning about positive framing, about knowing who your audience is and how to communicate to that audience. So I think that's why this work is so crucial, because more journalism coverage is going to happen, and we can steer the narrative in that coverage by going into an interview prepared, knowing which questions to ask, and knowing how to steer the conversation and get our key points across.
Thank you so much. I would like to open the floor up for comments and questions. We don't have much time. I apologize for that. We seem to have not managed that very well. And then welcome our panelists.
Violence and the backlash that comes with that because of the work that we do and who we are. So what does it mean in our activism for people that are putting out their heads and necks out there for their safety and security? And also on social media within this movement, what does solidarity look like? So I really am concerned about social media, the new media, the interactive media, that doesn't give people, that doesn't need to put people in the same room to say what they want to say to each other, and the violence that comes with that. So how do we deal with that? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we'll take 2 more questions and then we're ready to go. Yes, I will.
Afternoon. So my name is Linda Ramini. I'm the Advocacy and Communications Manager at the Royal Hall. Yes, so my question is basically, before the question, let me applaud the panel. And then on the strategies, basically on capacitating journalists on activism as an option. But the problem now remains that these journalists have a wider coverage than us, the conventional media houses. So how to actually go about counteracting that?
Okay, hi. My name is Ruth. I'm a journalist from Ghana, and I cover a lot of LGBTI issues. My biggest concern with advocacy institutions is that they don't take time to train their officers on the jobs of journalists. Because you have a story, you have to write it. First of all, it needs to be balanced. You need to bring out different voices regarding whatever content you're producing. And as part of media ethics and different editorial policies, unless you're paying for space, you really have no business trying to get my story and fixing it to go according to your organization's expectations. Unless you're buying space. That's where you write what you write in the paper. And for the lack of a better word, it can be very unweighing. You're here trying to get a message across, and you have somebody on your neck trying to micromanage your work you went to school for, and you've been training very hard. Yeah, that's what I was saying.
I think we've got 2 more questions. Yes, please.
Hello. My name is Abon Gibe from South Africa. I've got 2 questions. One, in terms of the sensitizations or working with journalists, we target the media houses because I don't know how the hierarchical bureaucracy works in terms of the ethics or values of those houses versus the individual journalist report. So in terms of framing, you would say, for example, suggest a way to engage LGBTI issues, and then upon publication, those media houses do not agree. So do they also, are they also informing, or are they also included within your reach in terms of sensitization and working with journalists, media houses like the big one, the Herald, or whatever the case may be? And secondly, I'm concerned about rights, particularly in relation to language. So it seems like once you mention rights, you get a lot of backlash. You are struggling to find space in terms of language, but we are in a space of speaking about rights. We are wanting to own them, or wanting to make sure that they are elevated for all people to reach. But it seems once you mention rights, whether in policy, whether in the media, there's backlash. So I'm concerned about that, and I'm wondering how best can we approach that. Thank you.
My name is Sam from Zanarela. I'm actually a MIP officer, also a strong activist in issues to do with a lot of what we're deliberating on. But my question still goes back to the discussant and the people that are here, because I'm trying to find out as an M&D officer, it's all about figures, quality, and trying to capture so that you are able to note the movement, the progress, and so forth. So as of now, there is a hashtag expanding spaces that we're supposed to start using to communicate or to send messages. How many from this room have done that, have tweeted, have hashtag expanding spaces in what you are doing now? Then the reason why I'm saying so is because of the sales, messaging, advocating. We are supposed to be celebrating what we are doing and how far we've been moving. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we'll take one last question. two last questions. We have 10 minutes left. So I also just want to mention that please remember that after this, there are going to be breakaway sessions where, if you wish, you can engage further on those same issues with the panelists. But yes, Carol.
Hello everyone. I'm Carol Mutengi from Zimbabwe, Ohio. I would just like, I heard, could you draw the link between what's happening programmatically and then what the comms officer is then required to do, right? Because on our end, when we then receive a brief to then just say, maybe there's a protest in such and such an area, there's really no story there. However, if there's, for example, let's use recent xenophobic violence in the country, right? If you then come to me and then say there were X amount of LGBT plus people from, Malawi, from Zambia, who were at the community center, for example. So then the story becomes a part of the bigger story, but there's a very clear slant, which is incredibly relevant to the bigger story. So what role then, and what should the relationship look like between the comms officer as well as the program lead? Thanks.
That was the last question, right? Oh,
I'm not sure whether I can speak because the mic is in my hand. Should I sit down? This conversation is action-based. And there's something that I think we've left behind in our movement. And it's engage in communications on a structural basis. And this is based on the amount of homophobia and transphobia we receive in our countries through the media itself. So my question is, what have you guys done as panelists there to engage issues around access to information as a right, and to ensure it becomes a structural framework that also guides the policies at media houses? Because media houses are guided also by the communications bill. And then you have the public institutions that sanction us from being featured in the press. So what have you guys done to keep our states accountable and the media houses accountable to ensure that the stories that are coming out are also ensuring that every person's access to information and the right to information is attained?
It's an important question. Thank you all so much for your questions and comments. Does anybody want to start? If you're particularly excited about a question.
Yeah. The first question was on social media and the backlash that comes sometimes after posting materials on the social media. Yes, social media is indeed a big elephant, but one of the things that needs to be done is try as much as possible to also recruit many friends and many allies. There was a practical example in Malawi, I think a month or two ago, and my colleague is even here. Chippy, I think, is here somewhere. Yeah, Chippy is here. He was attacked. Physically, he was physically assaulted. And he posted that on social media. Some homophobia started even insulting him. But we joined forces and we outnumbered the negative homophobic comments that were coming. As a result of the so many comments and even the actions that was taken, the people who assaulted him have been arrested and are being prosecuted. In Malawi, that's a milestone because initially, when you report, you were the one who was being arrested. But the tables have now turned. The issue was on social media, people from all over the world, not only in Malawi, all over the world, sympathized, encouraged him, and the suspects have been arrested, as I've said. So it's better also to recruit as many allies as possible who will stand with you. That's just one of the techniques. But again, this battle requires a thick skin, honestly. So, yeah, recruitment of allies is important. Somebody touched on the issue of the news values. I practiced journalism for 15 years. as a reporter and as an editor. And I hate those news values. When you want to print something, then somebody prominent should say something, prominence, significance, and whatsoever. The most important news value to any good journalist should be humanity. The most important news value amongst those of you who are practicing should be humanity. Would I be happy to see my fellow human being harassed, assaulted? That should be the key. But for some reason, we are still sticking to those colonial news values. We are still worshipping them. As media practitioners, there is also need to rethink some of those news values. For those who are not in journalism, for something to be called news, they say that the first thing, the one who has done it should be prominent. If you just slap the president, what? That will be news. But if you slap me, that will not be news. I mean, that's the barometer they use. Who have you slapped? The president. Hey, that's big news. President slapped. But you come and slap me, you say that's not the news. But the question is that humanity, the Ubuntu that we were referring to. So even media practitioners need retraining and rethinking of some of these news values. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brian. And please feel free to offer some concluding remarks while you're at it. Sure. If you have a response to some of the questions.
I want to try to respond to all of the questions in 10 seconds or less. So the first one about safety, I just recommend everyone look at this resource called Security in a Box for LGBTQI activists. It has a lot of excellent physical and digital security tips. The question about how do we counteract journalism, we're never going to be as big as them, my answer is don't. We need to realize that journalists will have enormous power and we should engage with that, and as well as during our own social media, also work with journalists. About Ruth, about training communications officers about the jobs of journalists, we do that, and I can show you those slides later and kind of what we talk through, but we try to give them a sense of the reality and the difficulty of it all. I also wanted to say, Ruth, I know, and Carl, I know, hate press releases, but I still think it's important that we all write press releases because it helps us really craft the message and decide what our core message should be, and some of the journalists will still use them. Very good journalists will not copy and paste them, but some will still use them to further inform their information. I'm not going to succeed in what I tried to do, but I did just want to add that a lot of the questions were about the qualities of journalism, how do we respond, and I think that the Media Monitoring and Response Coalition is going to get at a lot of that, so please come and we'll tell you more about that. But we want to really use that as a resource.
Thank you so much, Brian. Carla, it would be great to hear from you, and then you, Stephen.
Just quickly, to try and answer all the questions with a single approach. These questions demonstrate why this is a conversation about strategy as opposed to about tools. And one of the key issues about strategy is that we are a stigmatized minority. A lot of people hate us. A lot of people don't understand us. A lot of people don't care about us. So our primary role is to connect ourselves to other issues all the time. My question around social media, for instance, is a question. Is it the best thing to lead with an identity-based approach on something like social media when we know everybody hates us? Isn't it perhaps a better question, questions to be asking, like we asked this morning? If people are saying, well, what about women? Where are they in these things? Asking the question, well, what do LGBT people and women have in common? We're both messed up. I've grown up, I used to say another word there. We both messed up by toxic masculinity and patriarchy. How about if we were talking about that rather than about my identity as an LGBTI person? Similarly, the the issue of rights. Let's not talk about rights, but let's not use the language of rights to talk about rights. Let's unpack that into everyday words that people use. I remember talking to an activist in Kenya and saying, have you talked to your parents about being gay? She said, absolutely not. I said, if you imagined a conversation, what would you say? She said, give me my rights. I said, I don't know about your mother, but if I went to my mother and said, give me my rights, the first right I would have would be a slap around the ear, let me tell you. So we have to find a different way of speaking a language that everybody does, and finding, just like Glenn said, like people put it so beautifully, it may be that the public campaigns we wage now as LGBT people have nothing to do with our identity, and have everything to do about the freedom of press, have everything to do about having an independent judiciary, have everything to do about saying democracy is critical and the government must be accountable to people, that equality matters for everyone. You don't have to be LGBT, but if we, as LGBT people, are not visible in those fights, and all too often we are not, how can we then expect all the other activists to be visible when we get beaten up? I'm serious. This is a strategy discussion, and we were so careful about our strategy of engaging with leadership. Now is the time to have a strategy around how do we shift hearts and minds, which is actually the scariest discussion of all, particularly if you've ever met my mother.
Brian, your last comments, please. Stephen, sorry.
Only two
I will
Brian's.
not categorize the questions, but I'll just, in the interest of time, I think about the aim of journalism. I think you should understand that journalists are not exactly an extension of your PR department. I'm just trying to be very direct. They also have their editorial policies, their influence somewhere. So there's need to engage them. How? You obviously, the last time I was in the newsroom, like this time around the day, you are very worried about sources. You want people to comment on a story, you want things to back up your story, and the story is supposed to come tomorrow. You don't have those. So when you have your workshops as activists, when you produce your documentaries, when you produce your reports, when you have events, please invite those journalists so that they understand the nature of the work that you do. When they understand what you do, then there is little conflict between journalists, there is no them and us. So the second point is that gatherings such as this particular social intercourse, the kopano, are very important, but I think they should also be structured. We can have this gathering today, but let's have some specific targets with specific timelines. In our workshop, we had 5 journalists who wrote stories out of 25. But if you look at it, you may think that is negative. But if you look at it again, you will see that at least now in Zimbabwe, journalists can actually have a workshop to discuss about the LGBTI community. So for us, it was like, this is positive. We should celebrate that like we said. Otherwise, about social media, I think mainly the backlash in social media is in the form of insults and some abusive language. But I think one thing that can counter that is if somebody insults you, because most of the homophobia is coming out of lack of understanding or lack of true facts. Jesus said this, but does Jesus say that? Please back up with research. They are posting insults, post-research, post-facts, research-based answering. Otherwise, thank you very much.
I have the pleasure of gifting the panelists with stuff. Here you go. Just pass it on. I want to thank you very much, Carla, Brian, and Stephen for your amazing contributions. And we're looking forward to hearing more from you as well about what you have learned in your own work around communications and evidence-based communications. I want to acknowledge, of course, that the question about accountability was not really answered, but I hope that in the breakaway rooms, especially the 3 of you, can dig a little deeper. Maybe somebody could respond to Linda Bowman's question. Lastly, just to say that unfortunately, because we don't have much time, I would have loved to have the opportunity to share a little bit about Australia's work with supporting activists in Kenya to support to build their own skills and capacity around strategic communications work. I want to highlight that my colleague Raviva Hansa is sitting somewhere at the back over there. She's our strategic communications manager at Australia. And if you'd like to talk a little bit more about what we've learned from our work in Kenya, she's available, I'm available. But otherwise, I'd like to thank you very much for this amazing session. And Kay will speak a little bit more about the breakaway sessions.